We'll probably get rolling, but because we have such a small crew, of course, keep your cameras off if you want to, or turn them on and join us. I think we were brainstorming in thinking about this workshop, what to do if we had like 1,000 people, 3 people, and we were really hoping for a smaller group actually, so that we could have a more in-depth conversation with people about what is bringing them to this session. So we're very glad to see you here, and we welcome you to participate as energetically or as prior to your first cup of coffee as you're coming to this session. So I will turn it over to Wesley now.
Okay. Welcome everybody to the session. And I wanted to start off this with the first 3 words of podcasting is hard. And it's made all the more difficult because for many people, it is an "and I also" kind of situation. Whether you're a person associated with some sort of institution that's been asked to start a podcast, or somebody who's working on a podcast outside of whatever it is you do to buy yourself food. Because of this fact, considering how a podcast is going to fit within your life or your job is an important part of success. We're going to discuss 3 aspects of being successful in that, how to set up and structure your podcast in a sustainable way, how to scale your project manageably, and then how to advocate for resources when you need them. These are 3 areas in which we have learned many lessons over the course of our histories in podcast production, and we hope we can help others by talking about some of the, quite honestly, mistakes that we've made along the way. So who are we? So my name is Wesley Livesay, and in 2014, I hoped to engage in my love of history in a more meaningful way. And to do so, I started History of the Great War, a weekly podcast that covers the First World War. And then in spring 2020, I started a new podcast creatively titled History of the Second World War. I'm also joined by Laura Perry and Dan Richards. Laura is the Andrew W. Mellon Postdoctoral Scholar for the Humanities for the Public Good program at the University of Iowa. In spring 2021, she hosted a series of conversations with podcast creators about the intersections of audio and academia before joining the Humanities for the Public Good. Laura was the managing editor at the Edge Effects magazine, a digital magazine and podcast about environmental issues out of the Center of Culture, History, and Environment at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. Dan is a radio and podcast producer based in Providence, Rhode Island. He currently is the producer and co-host of Trending Globally, a public policy and politics podcast from Brown University. Prior to that, Dan produced shows for the Financial Times, Insider Inc., and Vice Media. He also reported and produced programming for public radio stations across New England and is a graduate of the Transom Story Workshop. One of the challenges, when speaking on such a broad topic like podcast and life balance is that every situation is different. We bring 3 very different backgrounds and 3 very different sets of experiences, but everybody has different challenges and different questions. That's why we want your questions to help shape the course of this workshop. After each of our discussions, we will be taking questions on that topic from chat. And then at the end, we'll be answering questions on any topic around podcasting, life, and really everything in between. You can drop those questions in chat at any time, and I will collect them up and present them to the group. And I'm going to turn it over to Laura, who is going to chat a bit about how we want you to be involved in the next hour.
Yeah, and thank you for that great introduction. And also, I will say, not even in the next hour, like right now, we're going to jump in because there's something that I have experienced over the past however long this virtual experience has been that I really enjoy, called a chatterfall, which is meant to be a waterfall of chatting in Zoom. So the way that it works is that I'll ask a question and then you'll all type your responses in the chat box, but you won't press send. And I will include Dan and Wesley in this as well, so we can really have a roaring chatterfall. And when I say go, then you press send. And so all of the chats appear at once. And it takes some of the pressure off of feeling like everyone is sitting there and reading your inevitable typo, but also it really is a fun way to see a lot of connections between what people are saying and find those unexpected moments when someone uses the exact word that you use. So That's what we're going to jump in and do right now is the Chatterfall. And feel free to keep your cameras off or turn them on as you want to throughout this session. And we totally understand that many of you are juggling things in the background and tiny humans. So thank you so much for joining us. So the Chatterfall question that I'm hoping to ask you is a very simple one. It's what brings you to this session today? In one sentence, in 3 or 4 words. And remember, type it, but don't press return yet. Keep it in that, waiting in that box. And so I'll give you a little while as people make their typing faces, but don't press send yet. Well, usually someone presses send yet. You guys have been really, really good at not doing that. Okay. So in 3, 2, 1, send. Ah, lovely. Okay, so balance being a grad student and a podcaster. Yes, I also tried to do that. Very difficult, some real late nights, totally with you there. Yeah, trying to figure out how everyone else does it. I think we're all just like ducks in that if we look smooth, it's not. There's actually a whole bunch of activity happening underwater. Great, Wesley, a complete failure to maintain a proper podcast life balance. I'm glad that's the attitude that you're coming to with this. And yeah, Milan, who's amazing, who's involved in the Humanities Podcast Network. The feasibility of starting a podcast. Ooh, I'm so glad you're at that stage, because that is exactly what Dan was hoping to talk about, is catching people before they're married to a format and really, thinking through how to create a podcast that's structured the way that might work best for you. And yeah, 2 podcasts going, wow, okay, I've only ever tried to have one at a time. So bravo, that's some true juggling. All right. So that's a Chatterfall, and I'm really excited that all of you are joining us. And now I think I will hand the baton to Dan, who is going to get us started off thinking about setting yourself up for success.
Very cool. Hello, everyone. Yeah, so like Wesley said, I work, I actually produce podcasts full-time for an institute at Brown University. That's the Watson Institute for International and Public Affairs. And so my job, in addition to producing sort of our main podcast, which we could talk about more, just that's a bi-weekly show. That was a decision we made. But also I end up helping a lot of people in the community sort of brainstorm how to start a podcast and how to kind of conceptualize it and how to fit it into their life in a way that it will feel like the kind of like successful, fulfilling project they want. And, it was interesting. Just a few days ago, I was thinking about what I wanted to say in this conference, and then I had a meeting with a department head at this institute at Brown who wanted to start a podcast. And so she called me and we chatted about it. And, it was an interesting conversation. I think touched on a lot of what I was thinking of bringing up here. But yeah, so she basically wanted to start a podcast. She'd had an experience talking with a colleague who was making a podcast. She's come to like podcasts. I'm sure many of you are just familiar with, like, lots of people are getting this idea, and that's awesome. But I think there are some things to think about up front that you might not know, if you haven't done it before, about how to frame your podcast, how to think about releasing it, that could maybe make it a little bit of a better fit for your life before you kind of get into it. Because at this point too, podcasts have become there's such a variety of what they are. Saying I want to start a podcast is, it's kind of like saying, like, I want to start a TV show, and it's like, oh, well, that could mean like your local access programming, or it could mean like the Mayor of Easttown, or like Game of Thrones. There's like such a wide range of what it can be. So a lot of my job is helping just think through those things, those details a little bit more. So the first thing I brought up with this professor was what was the format she was interested in. And she was very clear. She wanted it to be an interview-based show, which I think is very, common. And I think in like academic settings is a very common way to go. I mean, some people also want to dive into some sort of narrative big project, and that's awesome. But most of the time, I think people just want to sort of have interesting conversations with people they find interesting. So that's what she was looking to do. And even within that, there's a lot of variation, but we could get into that if folks have questions or whatever. But so then we kind of got into the question of like, okay, so you want to do this, aside from getting some of the technical stuff figured out, also like, what do you want it to look like? What format? How long do you want the episodes to be? How many episodes do you want to have, come out in a given time frame? And this is the part that I think a lot of people, when they're starting out, could benefit from just kind of like letting their imaginations like run sort of wild with it. Because I think I at least have felt, and it took me a while to not feel this way, sort of felt like there was kind of almost like there was like 2 or 3 options for a podcast. It was like, oh, it comes out every week, or maybe it comes out every 2 weeks, or it like comes out as like a season, and it's like a really, coherently packaged, almost like a book with chapters, and like those are all great, but those aren't the only ways to go. So some of the other options I talked about with this professor. So yeah, we did talk a little bit about the season format, because I had some success doing that with another professor. And the other thing, I have a luxury where I produce these shows full time, but so much of it is figuring out how to fit it into, like what Wesley said, it's like the 4th or 5th or 6th thing you're trying to work on. Oh, season format. I'll just answer that right now. Is that all right? Yeah. So, a lot of shows will kind of bundle their releases, almost like how a TV show has a season, and there'll be a big break of months. And then there will be a period when, maybe the episodes come out really regularly, maybe weekly or every other week, or just randomly, but like within a shorter time frame. And so that way you can, make episodes without the pressure of releasing them for a few months and kind of build them up. And then you can put them out to the world, and you're not in that sort of grind of every week I'm making a show for the next week, And I think that's a format that people are getting more and more familiar with. Yeah, so this is another question. I'm going to get to this in a sec about the release schedule and things like that. But well, actually, yeah, I'm gonna. So basically, the option we ended up figuring out with this professor was to just pilot an episode on our institute's regular podcast channel. It'll be like a bonus episode on our channel. And I think piloting, experimenting, trying something out once is like always a great way to go. And to do it before you've made some public statement that like, I'm going to be doing this every week for the rest of my life. And, I think if nothing else, just try making one on your own. And it doesn't even have to exist on a podcast app or a phone, just like try making a thing, and, email it to friends and listen to it. I think that's a great way to go. And if you can figure out how to connect with maybe an existing podcast and maybe try something out as a sort of a bonus episode or something like that, I think it would be a great way to sort of get your feet wet with the whole process, kind of beginning to end. And I think there's so many shows out there now that I think, it's worth, just like if you have friends or colleagues who are making shows, people are increasingly interested in this sort of idea of like putting other things on your own podcast feed. Some people are very protective of their, but it's worth at least exploring as an option. And yeah, so this actually then gets me to the release stuff, the question here. Yeah, I mean, I think what's something to keep in mind is like, if you look on the internet about like best practices for like releasing podcasts and things like that, so much of it comes from like a commercial world, a commercial podcasting industry. And yeah, I don't think it's like often as applicable. And like, for example, there's a show at our institute that a professor has, and the episodes are totally at random. They're just like when he booked the time to chat with the person. But the content is, it's not so timely that it's going to be dated in a few months. It's years, talking about big issues in macroeconomics and history. And what's really cool about that show is it comes out randomly, but over the course of a few years, the podcast itself has become this archive of sorts. And, it's on the website for this institute, and students in these classes, can subscribe to this podcast, and they just sort of get the whole archive. And only 1 or 2 or 3 new episodes might come up while they're a student, but it's just like another way to like share the material with people. And that show has been going on for a while, and the professor loves it, and it doesn't suck up all his time. And, I feel like he's figured out a setup that's kind of working great for him. But yeah, I think the ideas of weeklies and whatever, I think a lot of that was created by advertisers, and it's what advertisers demand. And, it would be great if we all got advertisers if we wanted and made lots of money. But in the meantime, I think it's more important to think, how much time do I have at what times of year? And like, what could fit in from there, instead of how do I fit my life into this other kind of schedule? So that's sort of the big picture stuff. And if you guys have questions, or we can talk more about it later, or, those are my main thoughts.
We may just have time to answer this one question, and then we'll move on, and we'll have more time for questions at the end.
Yeah. Oh, how does the academic institute that hosts your podcast promote new episodes, email blast, subscriptions? Yeah, we actually just started. So we have a social media manager at the institute, and she promotes it on, Twitter and Instagram and stuff. We have also recently started doing an email newsletter with every episode, which has been awesome, because I think a lot of people, you tell the guest, share it on social media. Some guests are big on social media, some aren't. But now we say to these guests, some of whom are like scared of social media, we say, we send out an email every time there's a new episode released. Send us, as many emails as you want, if you have colleagues or a list or anything like that. And we'll just put them on this email like one time. They won't be stuck on it forever. But, instantly, we had someone send us like 200 emails once from their institute. And there was people who never would have found the episode otherwise. So that's been a nice little experiment.
Okay, so I thought a good place to start for me was to talk a little bit about my podcasting background. So unlike a lot of the presenters and I know attendees here, I'm not an academic. I have a degree in computer science, and I do software engineering as my day job. And I'm only here because I spend too much time on Twitter. And so I responded to a tweet when they were asking for people to come present. I started my podcast because I've always really enjoyed history, and I wanted to find a way to engage with it in a more meaningful way. And I distinctly remember thinking, how hard can it be? And the answer to that question is I was totally incorrect, but that's kind of a conversation for a different day. And since that first podcast started in 2014, it has required a constant balancing act between work, podcasting, and life. I now have 2 children under the age of 5, which just makes that balance that much more difficult. And there's probably a whole list of topics I could have talked about today when it comes to maintaining a podcast in such a scenario, but I wanted to talk specifically about expectations. Expectations come in many forms. There are internal expectations that we place on ourselves. There are external expectations that are placed on us by others. And then there's what I call internal, external expectations, where we think people are placing expectations on us, but they actually aren't. But it doesn't matter because we think they're real, so we make them real. All of these expectations can grow and change over the course of a podcasting project. And this is particularly true sort of as your audience starts to grow. Internal expectations are probably a great place to start because they are simultaneously the easiest to identify and control, while also being very challenging to sometimes evaluate the consequences of. So part of internal expectations are exactly what Dan was just discussing: format, length, frequency, and a whole bunch of other important questions that are kind of part of setting internal expectations for yourself before your podcast even starts. And then as the audience for your podcast expands, it can be tempting to start changing things. In some cases, this can be good. Learning, changing, improving should always be pursued, but it can be tempting to change things in ways that begin to increase your time commitment to the podcast. To give a positive example of what you can do, back in 2014 when I started, I realized that I was not doing enough research. I didn't really realize that until a few episodes in, and I knew something had to change. I made the choice to increase my commitment to that research and, put in extra hours every week, just basically reading. This was, in retrospect, the correct change. It made the podcast fundamentally better, but it also increased my enjoyment because I knew I was making a better product, which made me want to make it more. But I think the most common pitfall of podcast is as they start to gain an audience, they want to change their own internal expectations around the pace at which content is released. People start listening. People are liking the thing I do. I should do more of it by releasing more episodes or making episodes longer or spending a bunch of time doing, social media advertising or whatever other ways you're trying to get word out about your podcast. This can be a very bad move, especially when it comes to podcasts built around humanities topics. If your podcast episodes don't become out of date within a few weeks, over time, you will have way more people listening after the days, weeks, and months of release than you do on the days, weeks, and months of release. This means that pushing out more content every week may only have marginal effects on sort of listener enjoyment and listener engagement. And it's better to almost always play the long game and not let yourself get kind of sucked into, I should be making more, which is so common in all forms of sort of internet content production. External expectations can be placed on you by other people. Sometimes these are well known and defined, but they can very quickly expand in some unexpected ways. So I'm going to use another personal example from one decision I made back in 2016, because I started a crowdfunding campaign for my podcasting efforts. With that crowdfunding, I offered bonus episodes to supporters, but that actually wasn't the problem. When I created that campaign, I did not really consider how it would change my relationship to my podcast. People were giving me real money, and so they expected episodes to be released, both supporter-specific episodes and normal episodes as well. That single decision took what had been a hobby I could walk away from at any moment to something that very rapidly became a second job. My advice is to simply be careful with creating those expectations, whether they are something that commits you to a greater time commitment or just places constraints on your relationship with the project. Here in a bit, Laura is actually going to talk about some ways to deal with some of these external expectations, and more importantly, how to get help when you might need it. Which brings me to the third category, internal external expectations, which, to be clear, I'm pretty sure I just made up for this presentation. I've never heard it used before, but they can be tricky, especially for podcasts. Sort of by its nature, podcasting can feel like you're speaking into the void, either by yourself or with co-hosts or with somebody you're interviewing. An episode is prepared and then recorded and then produced and then released to a world of listeners, most of which you do not know, will never know, and will never interact with in any meaningful way. What feedback you might get can be easy to kind of expand out to a wider audience or map onto a wider audience. Taking feedback in general requires some sort of caution, but that is doubly true when talking about anonymous online feedback, which is often what you can get from podcasts, because people online are often complete monsters. As your podcast grows, it is then exposed to more people. And just by the law of averages, you start getting negative feedback from people. Most podcasters that have been podcasting for a while have a story of that 1-star iTunes review that says their voice sounds funny, or a listener who writes like a 5,000 word email about that one thing you said 3 years ago on that one episode. Keeping this kind of feedback in perspective is important because most of the people who listen to your podcast enjoy it and they want you to keep doing what you're doing. They don't expect you to never miss a release window or to never talk about something they don't want to hear about. And they don't expect you to never take breaks. These can be types of things that we place on ourselves when nobody is really asking us, even if we don't realize it. Okay. Any questions on that topic? But yes, I do spend too much time on Twitter. I try to cut down on Twitter, but it just keeps pulling me back in. And I also wanted to, kind of expand on that release window question from earlier. I think that one thing that has amazed me, so I do a history podcast, so it's essentially evergreen and never kind of goes out of date unless there's like new scholarship, I guess. And it is amazing how many people are constantly sort of catching up with the episodes on a monthly basis. Often my very first episode back in June 2014, which to be clear is awful, is often my most downloaded episode. And so people catch up all the time. And so I think a lot of times, Dan is absolutely correct. When you go out there and you look for podcasting advice, a lot of that is driven off of sort of corporate podcasts and a lot of them on topics that expire. You're not going to go listen to sports podcasts from 2014. But a lot of humanities topics do not have that constraint in any way. Yeah, I think, when it comes to the amount of content that you're creating, it can become especially a giant trap, because if you start tracking statistics on downloads, the temptation to start like, oh, I can squeeze another episode in and look at those numbers go up even more. It's fantastic. And then once if you start monetizing, if you start having sponsors or advertising on your podcast, that adds an additional sort of push to be like, okay, if I can just kick out a couple more episodes this month. But long-term sort of consistency isn't the right word, because I'm not saying you have to release every single week, but long-term, I'm still working on this project. I can is far more important than cramming in 5 episodes in that week because you got a new advertising deal. How long is the season format is a challenge. I think breaks are good. I think people probably overestimate how many people you lose during breaks. For example, my first podcast actually ended in 2019. I sort of stopped releasing episodes and sort of started preparing for my second one. And so over the course of a year, I released nothing on that old podcast feed. It just sat there. But then I released some like old crowdfunding like episodes, so like releasing them to everybody instead of the people who were supporting me on the crowdfunding. And the download numbers after a year were basically exactly the same as they were when I stopped. I think a lot of people with how podcast subscriptions work, where people click subscribe and then they never have to look at it again because they're looking at new release lists and stuff like that. I think the unsubscribe numbers are actually pretty small these days because people aren't having to actively go out and find your podcast to listen to it. They are just subscribing one time, and then when things pop up in the list, they pop up and they listen. Laura, I'll be honest, I forgot to start my timer again. So just let me know. I'm getting close.
I think we're doing great because we had time built in for questions after people, and so I think you crushed it as far as timing went.
Okay,
so, bravo. Was that your way of handing the baton to me to get?
I'm gonna answer one more question because I didn't see it when I said that. So with the question about, or with the comments, it was not even a question, but I have to comment on it because I've seen it. You know, the pendulum swings wildly between I need to keep it running or I shouldn't do this anymore. One thing that I found really helps that, and this is something that is challenging to just give to people for advice because it's kind of unique to my experience. So again, I do a history podcast, which is heavy on research and then well-prepared episodes that are just me talking. It's kind of like a lecture format. So what helps me in that situation is that it gives me ability to constantly be doing different things. Oh, this week, I really just cannot read any more of these government documents from 1936. Okay, then I'm going to go organize the stuff I read last week, or I'm going to, outline an episode that comes out 3 weeks from now, or anything like that. And so my advice is always like, if possible with your podcasting project, one of the things that can help you get through periods where it's like, I shouldn't do this anymore, is to just find different things to do, right? Whether that's, let's, instead of, on this Saturday morning when I usually work on the podcast, I'm just going to go look for people I want to interview in the future. I'm just going to make a list. That's cool. Also, I think that a good break can be to just sit down and think about all the cool things you can do in the future, because that's the best part, because you don't actually have to do anything at that point. You can just make a fun list of fun things. Okay. And now I'll hand it off to Laura, who has more things to talk about.
All right. And I also love making lists. So I appreciate any suggestion that begins with make a list, because I am just covered in Post-its all the time. So I'm going to talk about advocating for resources, which I realized as I was thinking about it ends up being advocating for revolution sometimes. So why think about advocating for resources as part of the podcast life balance? It's because having a structure, a system, or even a team that supports your work and that also recognizes your work, your labor as work, as something that is part of your job or part of your scholarship or part of your service or your teaching, is a major part of podcast life balance. The moments in my life when I didn't feel like I could juggle my podcast were because I was trying to do it on top of everything else. I already had a full plate and nothing on that plate was making room for podcasts because the plate didn't think of podcasts as edible, to really extend the metaphor. But so I'll be sketching this out in the university academic context, because I know that's where many of us are sitting, but I also know that there are some people in this Zoom room who have experience in other contexts or who are currently outside of the university context. And so I really welcome that perspective too. So my first thought about advocating for resources is working within the system as it exists. So thinking about what you have access to already that could be used to support podcasting, and advocating that podcasting fits into that category. So professional development grants, conference and travel and research funding, those could be directed towards podcast trainings and workshops like Transom, which Stan has been to, or Story Center, which I was lucky enough to use part of my professional development funding to attend a Story Center workshop, which is not related to the topic of my dissertation when I was working on it, or my current postdoc, but it fit enough within the constraints of the professional development grant that I was able to use it for that. There's also the National Humanities Center has several podcasting workshops for both grad students and faculty that you can imagine would certainly fit within the realm of conference funding. So another aspect of advocating for resources and thinking about the resources that you already have is technical. Could your unit fund your access to Adobe Creative Cloud and so give you access to Audacity? Could your position give you access to microphones or recording studios or online tutorials from lynda.com that you might otherwise have to pay for? One of the amazing things about being a graduate student is that you have given access to all of these spaces on campus and all of these on-campus resources that mean that you can essentially rent out a microphone that might otherwise cost you like $175 from the library for free. which is what I used to do when I was a grad student juggling a podcast, is I would rent that microphone timed judiciously for recording the interview and recording my intro and outro, and borrow recording studio space from the education department or the student radio station. And it's easier to do things like that if you are working at the university or going to the university. But even if you're in a city that has an independent radio station or has a bunch of recording studios, sometimes all it takes is a friendly email that reaches the right person that might give you access to those resources that are not widely or publicly advertised. So even just taking a moment to research around and see what you might be able to borrow instead of pay for because of the location that you're in or the position that you're in at a university. So, but the broader idea where these resources become revolution is about advocating for changes that could better support innovative and engaging work like humanities podcasting. So my interest in this is not only selfish, because I wish that there were like 10,000 positions like Dan has instead of, 2, I think is what you said, Dan. You've only ever met one other person who has a professional university podcasting gig, because it sounds like a dream gig, and it also sounds like the kind of position that would make humanities podcasting more possible for a lot of people if you had someone who was dedicated to shouldering a lot of the burdens of podcasting. But it also comes out of the goal of the position that I currently have at the Humanities for Public Good program at Iowa, where one of the goals of that program is rethinking grad education and rethinking the structure and the design of it and the component parts of it, like the dissertation, like comprehensive exams, like mentoring, like curriculum, to better support the innovative and experimental and public facing work like podcasting. So often you get to year 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 of your humanities degree, and that's when you realize you want to learn these other skills, or that's when you realize that it's podcasting that is really where you want your future to be. As Latif Nasser was saying yesterday, that he was writing his dissertation and then he realized that what he was looking forward to at the end of every week was the meetings where he was brainstorming podcast ideas instead of his own research. And instead of having to wait to the end of that career, the end of that degree, or the doing it on top of it and never having institutional support for it, there are a bunch of ways that universities and graduate education could make that work more supported. So what if dissertations could take the form of a podcast? I know of one out there that has done that actually was published via University of Iowa, but it sounds like it was a real rough road of it to convince people that this was a worthwhile format for your dissertation. What if tenure and promotion portfolios included a space for podcasting? Podcasting could be part of teaching, of service. Podcasts could be counted as publications. So podcasters part of HPN in our sort of behind the scenes meeting have talked about how hard it is to fit their work into existing structures of academic recognition. So writing a letter to get promoted and having to spend, a couple worthy sentences of that letter trying to even describe what a podcast is. Like a lot of times you have to really start at the basics if you're trying to explain to people who are not familiar with it. And as you've seen again, there's so much good work being done here. So like so many other aspects of public engagement, humanities scholars are being asked to learn and do podcasting on top of everything else, which isn't a sustainable way to do it. So I wanted to close by amplifying the work of my colleagues, and I promised Uli that I had planned to do this even before I knew we would be in the Zoom room, because Uli was one of the main co-writers of this op-ed that several of our group published in Inside Higher Ed, advocating for some of these changes. So I'll just read a paragraph from this op-ed, and then I will also drop the link in chat once I am done. Universities should support this new form of knowledge creation and recognize its distinct attributes without replicating the vetting processes and gatekeeping mechanisms of yesteryear. Universities should keep the independence of academic podcasters, but value their work in hiring, review, and promotion decisions. Universities should support faculty and student podcast creators at the institutional level. Institutional funding need not involve a major investment in equipment, but training and support, including workshops led by experienced podcasters and digital specialists, will let additional faculty incorporate this exciting new medium into their classroom practice and research projects. And this is the sentence that I really like. Universities need to create solid mechanisms to support and evaluate truly transformative work that can be assessed alongside publication, teaching, and service, as well as create robust structures to archive and share this work. So I think we're all continuing to brainstorm about that. And if that's kind of revolution in the university structure to support podcasting sounds appealing to you, please join us at our open forum ending the symposium today from 3 to 4, where we'll continue to talk about that. But right now, that's it from me, and I'm really looking forward to hearing your thoughts and maybe collectively troubleshooting some of what brings you to this Zoom room today. So jump in, Uli.
First of all, thank you so much. So Dan and Wesley and Laura, thank you so much, and for all the questions in the chat. So I have a question about something maybe between Dan and Wesley. So I have a podcast that has a lot of episodes, and it's a humanities podcast. It's on free speech, on great books, on scholars, something. And very briefly, my ambition or my intent was to change the conversation around free speech in universities. So I did 80 episodes, I think, with scholars, and I spent a lot of time actually finding sort of renowned constitutional experts and philosophers and students who are not white men over 60, because the conversation was very dominated by white men over 60 for particular reasons. And so in some ways, partly my podcast is also to demonstrate the range of scholarship being created and allow people to access that kind of range, and not just have the default, the 5 deans who are going to be called every single time there's an issue because they're the deans of Harvard, Berkeley, Yale law schools, who I also have on my podcast. I needed to create that kind of, and then I have the other people who are senior tenured faculty in the same schools, but who don't get called each time. My question is sort of, you create all this content, and this is also an archive. That word came up. This is perennial content. You're going to go back to it. Some of it is really about an incident at University of California 4 years ago about some speech issue. Okay, that's a little bit dated, but it always goes into a more philosophical legal discussion. So this idea of not keeping on producing more and more episodes. And one thing I don't do, which I think is really bad, I don't go back to my old episodes and remaster them. And I work at New York University, and Dan, I'm so jealous you guys have you at Brown, because we have an entire journalism department. It has a great, fantastic sort of new media strain, but that's really, they're friends of mine, but they're not in my world. There's nobody in the humanities. I've unsuccessfully applied 3 times at NYU to get funding for this. They've rejected it every time. They said, this is a nice hobby you have, more or less, which I kind of just, whatever, roll my eyes, I'm a full professor, but I fund all this out of my other work. So I give talks, and I sort of have to find a way, because I also have kids and have to pay for my life. I kind of find ways literally to get paid for a lecture. And that money I really earmark and say, okay, fantastic, I made money. I can actually now have 5 episodes edited. And I don't have the editing level that I should have. So the guy who runs the podcasting and journalism says you should have at least 10 or 11 hours or something, somebody editing 1 hour of content to really produce a really high level, super good episode. I don't have that budget at all. And the other thing is, I was told in the university, and I finished, that the rate I pay is $50, $50 per hour of editing. And people were very clear. They say, you cannot underpay that. You cannot pay people less than that. I have undergraduate students who do it for 15, minimum wage in New York State, but I'm paying 50. So that's, if I paid 10 hours, it's $500 an episode. I just can't do it. So 2 questions. To go back on previous content and remaster it or re-promote it, the way Wesley said, your first episode, June 14, that's the beginning of World War I, we get that. So would you go back to that or actually re-promote it or link it back to other groups now, or what Dan, you were saying, talking to a professor, we're not producing stuff that's going to, fade in relevance. So I'm just curious about balancing that. I don't know, that's my question in a way. In a way, there would be a moment for me to say, like, I don't take season breaks. I just do the episodes when my guests become available, because it's all guest-based. So when someone says, finally, they have time for me, I'll do the episode. And I spend an enormous amount of time trying to get guests, writing to people, preparing for that. That is like as much work sometimes just to get the right person to have a conversation. So maybe Ayani wants to come in. I don't know. Sorry, so I'll be done. Okay, I'll just use this. I don't know.
So I'll speak first to the remaster conversation. So I think my first 50 episodes are garbage. In terms of audio quality, in terms of content, bad. But people seem to like them, so I've just left them there. And I don't feel like I can just go back and fix the audio editing on them, right? I don't think as a person who has grown a lot in the last 7 years in terms of how I'm producing my podcast, I am unhappy with the content, or I have many new thoughts on what I said 7 years ago. So I personally do not go back and remaster stuff. I feel that if I was going to go back, I would have to just redo that episode entirely. I have to start from step one, and if it's like an interview, I would have to either re-interview or find somebody else to talk to or something, because things have changed so much. I also think that on like the audio quality side of things, I think I do all my own editing, which maybe I probably shouldn't. It would probably sound better if I didn't. But I do think that there is a certain level you need to get to, probably in terms of audio quality, but I think there is maybe too much emphasis on audio quality and not enough emphasis on content, on being an engaging person to listen to, and having engaging interviews with people, where I think that sometimes audio quality is overvalued, but of course I'm not a podcast producer, so Dan is probably going to tell me why I'm audio quality. But I'll pass it over to Dan for your part.
No, I totally agree. I think it should never be a barrier to trying to make stuff. I mean, I like stuff when it sounds good, but I don't think people should, let it get in the way of making what they want. One just quick thing I'll say, and I think that comes to mind for me is like, we'll often re-promote episodes on social media. If it's Earth Day and we did a thing about climate change 9 months ago, or we'll promote it that way. That is helpful because there's like active social media presence that I'm less involved with. So I get to just like give that away at the Watson Institute, which is also why I'm very lucky. But, another thing, like, I think a great thing about podcasting is you could be so like candid and like a human. And I mean, I don't know your podcast, but, one thought that came to mind to me was like, maybe if there was an episode you really liked that you thought didn't get the exposure you would have liked it to, or maybe it's feeling especially relevant right now, like put a new intro on it and put it back in your feed, and say, hey, this is an interview I thought was really, fascinating and really reminded me of X, Y, and Z. This was from early on in the project, and the quality is, the sound quality is a little iffy, but I think you all really enjoy it if you haven't listened. And if you have already, there'll be a new one coming out soon. Okay, here's my thing from 2018.
Can I ask you a follow-up sort of, I'm sorry, Laura, to take this. So I have a lot of content, which I'm very happy about. So it's great. It's like 70 episodes, something like that. And I don't have really in my mind a feed where people say, oh, the most recent episode is Jane Austen's Pride and Prejudice. In my mind, I have this way too large web presence where people, and I think my listeners now come because they type in, Nietzsche, Good and Evil podcast, or they type in Kafka video. And I'm used largely by high school and college teachers and students who use it as a class assignment, where they say free speech, hate speech, and First Amendment, or whatever it is. So I think I get a lot of listeners there one time, and then I hope maybe they'll find me, but I don't really think I have so many followers I'm terrible on direct mail and subscription because it's too much for me in a way. So I feel like I have this content out there, and it gets, the way people come to it is through Google and YouTube, I think. And then they find one episode. So there's my episode on feminism or whatever, or on, I don't know. And so my question to you would be, the re-promotion I do sometimes on my social media. I'm like, oh yeah, it's so-and-so, Dora Neale Hurston's birthday today. Great, here's an episode, fantastic. Like that's, but I don't really feel people follow my podcast in that way at all. I think I'm creating an archive or something like that, or like a thing. And I can see, which I try not to do. At Wesley, I like that. I try not to look at the numbers, because I can tell you which is the most popular episode on my entire podcast. And I don't want to get sucked into that and say, keep producing only about this genre of writing. Like, I don't want to do only political philosophy or only something like that. So I'm just curious, like, I don't think at all like a new episode has anything new. It's just an episode. It doesn't have any more relevance than the one before or the one that came 2 years ago. Like, and I don't have a social media person. Like, I'm sort of just, I want to work at Brown and get like your guys to help me. Yeah. So I'll just call the team there. Because we don't have, literally there's zero, like it's kind of, there's not really support built into the university. And what Laura is saying, it's because I think people don't have any sense of, they don't know how to make sense of what I'm doing, which is fine with me. I don't really, there's a part of me also, I like it in a way. I kind of am under the radar, I do my project. But like, if I'd say to my department, they would be like, what do you want? Like, what, we don't do any of this at all.
So I'm just looking at the time, and Dan, I don't know if you have like something quick to say in response to that, but I also wanted to make sure we had time for Ayani's question, which maybe will bring up some of these same.
We also have a question from Jill in the chat, I think. So I'll go ahead and read Jill's question first. And then we'll get to Ayani right afterwards. Okay. I and a colleague have just started a podcast applying philosophical concepts and theories to the analysis of video games. Just for the record, if you make this podcast, send me a link. I want to listen. But we both work at a teaching-focused institution with high course loads, so we are considering releasing on a quarterly basis. But I gather that's an odd release schedule. Yeah, I think that's totally reasonable. I think that the one thing I always tell people when they're talking about lengthening their release schedules is that it's all about like your expectations of how much engagement you're going to have, right? One of the reasons that people tell you to, or if you look online, people will tell you to release like weekly, is because so much of a podcast is like building up that backlog, right? Especially in the humanities, again, with not expiring content. And so the quicker you get to 50 episodes, the faster you're going to get more people listening. So, quarterly is fine. It just may take you longer to build that audience over time. I don't know if Laura or Dan have any additional thoughts there.
Yeah, no, I think quarterly sounds great,
Yeah.
and then, if you find it's catching fire in some way, then you figure out from there. But I think sounds awesome.
Although make sure you don't, adjust your internal expectations too much and start trying to release faster. Don't fall into the trap.
Right.
Okay, I think we can go to,
yes.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. This was a great panel and definitely helped alleviate some of the stress that I have about podcasting. So thank you very much for that. So I have kind of an in-between question for everyone in like the 3 minutes that are left of the panel. So something that I am trying to wrestle with and juggle is that while I totally do not want to overtax myself with the kind of work that I'm putting into the podcast, I luckily have a co-host and we split a lot of duties. We still want people to listen to what we're doing. And it's hard to kind of try to find that sweet spot of, well, we want to get our word out there, but we also don't want to spend all our time on social media because we also have dissertations to write and other things to do. So I was wondering if you all could speak a bit about that balance of, yes, working and building up your backlog, but finding people who'd be interested in listening to your podcast, doing that kind of social media advertising. Like, is it worth it putting together a newsletter when you're a team of 2, those kinds of things?
One piece of advice that I learned from James Boo, who I had the chance to interview in the spring, and he is part of a podcast that tells different stories from Asian America every week, is he and his co-hosts, and he's the producer, and so I guess the host would appear on other people's podcasts. So related, like if they were doing a podcast about a podcast episode about immigration, for instance, they would reach out to other podcasters who maybe had bigger audiences, but who they were audiences that cared about the same topic, and appear on their podcast to talk about it. And so that's a way where it's not social media. It's not kind of that shouting into the void of like trying to build your Twitter following. It's doing what you already love to do and being on a podcast, but it then reaches a new audience in that way. So that was one idea that I thought was like, yes, of course, because I mean, as I've learned these past 2 days, like the podcasting community is really friendly. So I feel like if you reached out to someone and said, hey, we also do a podcast on like sex and literature, then, you know, like they'd be like, oh, cool, like great, let's come on to, you know, talk about Bridgerton. And so that I think would be one possible way to go that isn't social media, which it sounds like you're a little skeptical of, but maybe Dan and Wesley have other ideas.
Well, another one that stood out to me that's very similar that we've done a fair amount, and I can't say it's been a hugely measurable successful thing, but I think it has helped, is as you're doing a podcast, you know, do promotional swaps where you say at the beginning of your podcast, you'll say a little 30 seconds for another podcast. Hey, if you like this show, go subscribe to that show. And then they do that too. And it's just, yeah, again, if you're trying to think of ways outside of the sort of social media world, I think people are pretty receptive to when hosts, they like recommend stuff to them. Another thing I was just thinking about, and obviously I don't know, you know, your show or what you're thinking of having it, you know, be, but, you know, I do think there are just so many rules people make about podcasting, and like, they're all just like such kind of recommendations. And like, you know, I have a show, there's a professor at Brown who, you know, his show is like unedited, and it is like, he does not spend time editing this show, and he writes a host intro on the fly. And given this guy he's really charismatic, and he like is a really good talker, as we say, and it's so natural for him, but like it totally works for him. So like the idea of, oh, I have to spend X hours to edit a podcast, like, no, maybe you'll find some version that's like super chatty, and it's a little bit more like we record it, we cut 3 things out and we put it up, and like that might take less work and get you the same kind of stuff you want. So I don't know, I think it could be worth experimenting if there are ways to like shave off on the production side to get, if that's not the most sort of important part to you.
I have 30 seconds, even though we're over time, I have to say something. So one of the things I found incredibly helpful over the years is to find people who do similar podcasts on social media or by listening, and then interact with them. You know, I've had people like create episodes for my feed on topics roughly similar to what they're doing when they're just starting out. You know, when they're on episode 5 and 6, suddenly they have something on my feed so that my listeners hear them and find them. And also I think that just finding other people, and it even amplifies that social media sort of presence, right? It makes it easier when there's other people out there that are sharing your work to people who also sought out their work, which is similar. So I think, you know, trying to find other people like you doing the thing you do is very helpful as well.
Thank you all so much. I know we're over time, but I really appreciate it.
Mm-hmm.
Good luck to you all with
Yeah.
your projects.
Yeah, and Uli, sorry to cut you off. I feel like bring some of that same energy and questions to the open forum, because I think a lot of people are in the same boat as you are.
Yeah, it can get picked up.
Thank you. Thank you, everybody. It was great.
Thanks.
Yep. Bye.
Bye.